Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all here. My name's Ryan Streeter. I'm the Executive Director of the Civitas Institute. We're part of the School of Civic Leadership here at the University of Texas at Austin, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's afternoon symposium on economic dynamism. We've made that a core focus of what we do in terms of our research, writing, and inquiry at Civitas. At the Institute, we're really focused on individual liberty, studying its origins, studying what makes it possible, what constricts it. And because of that, we're interested in political liberty, we're interested in economic liberty, the questions that pertain to all of those things. And we found that if you care about individual liberty, you also do have to care about economic dynamism. You have to care about societies that spin off possibilities for people to realize the potential, people to pursue vocation, have options. If you care about self-expression, if you care about self-fulfillment, self-improvement, the fulfillment of potential, you find yourself caring about this question about what makes some places dynamic. Stagnating societies and places tend to constrict opportunities for people to become who they want to be, maybe who they should be. And we're interested in figuring out what sorts of things lead to stagnation and what we can do to reverse them as a matter of policy, as a matter of education, as a matter of culture. So a simple way to put it is, how do we get more people in more places making, building, and creating more good things? And by good things, I don't just mean stuff. I mean good enterprises, good companies, good associations, good communities, the kinds of things that make it possible for people to flourish in many places. We've even got a book on it now called Dynamism and Its Enemies, which is a collection of presentations from last year's inaugural symposium on dynamism. And the book's title, Dynamism and Its Enemies, is a not-so-subtle head nod to The Future and Its Enemies, the author of which, Virginia Postrel, is here, and you'll be hearing from her this afternoon. The title, surprisingly, was free. The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper preceded Virginia's book. I think someone's copied your book. I think there's another Future and Its Enemies out there by another author. Completely different, but yeah, someone copied it. I think there's Conscience and Its Enemies, Globalization and Its Enemies, but there was no Dynamism and Its Enemies. And so we focused on that last year. This year, you'll be hearing from a collection of authors who bring their historical, economic, and cultural perspective to these questions of dynamism, culturally and economically. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from them today. We've lost a couple to injury and illness. I'm sorry to report Megan McArdle's name was on the poster. She fell ill with one of those respiratory bugs going around today and will be unable to join us. But we like to keep things intimate here at the Institute, and the fewer in number also means more time with our coveted speakers today. The first of whom is Joel Mokyr from Northwestern University, a renowned economic historian, and we're so glad that you were able to join us today. Dr. Mokyr conducts research on the economic history of Europe, focusing primarily from the mid-18th century up to the beginning of World War I, focuses on the economic and intellectual roots of technological progress and growth of useful knowledge in European societies, as well as the impact that industrialization and economic progress have had on human welfare. Dr. Mokyr is a member of numerous prestigious academic societies and the winner of numerous prestigious awards. And if you care about the topic today and you haven't read his 2016 book, The Culture of Growth, you really must add that to your reading list and pick up a copy of it and read it. It's an absolute must-read if you care about understanding how dynamic, flourishing societies come to be. So please join me in welcoming Joel Mokyr to Austin, Texas.
Thank you, Ryan, for that brief introduction. But let me go straight to the point, okay? So the title, this is the real title of my talk, okay? And it's and where's this coming from? And you'll see that this is very much in line with the issue of dynamism. So there's an old debate, I guess it's kind of old, yeah, between sort of techno-pessimists and techno-optimists, as you might call them. That's still basically ongoing. And essentially, the techno-pessimist stance is that, eventually everything that can be invented will be invented. And from that point on, innovation is going to grind to a halt. And, it's not going to be in one blow, but future innovations are going to be increasingly less radical and less path-breaking, and will just be sort of little mopping up operations. But eventually, this whole process will stop. And so it's been argued that the economy faces various so-called headwinds. And headwinds are population aging and, a bunch of other things, national debt and so on and so forth. And so economic dynamism driven by innovation isn't going to be strong enough to counter those headwinds. And so basically the conclusion is that the US essentially is over the hill. So this is the magnum opus of techno-pessimism. This is my colleague, Robert J. Gordon. Many of you will have seen this book. It's a wonderful book of economic history that describes the technological development of the United States since the Civil War. But the last chapter basically says, look, the century since the Civil War has been absolutely wonderful, and we invented all these wonderful things, but they're already invented. We can't invent them again, okay? So things like antibiotics and indoor plumbing and, everything in between are already here. And so we'll never come up with inventions that are going to match those. And so now he's not alone in this. Here is a paper by 4 extremely distinguished economists that came out a couple of years ago. And basically, it's very much in the spirit of what Bob is saying, which is, new ideas are going to be harder and harder to find, in the sense that they will require more and more scientific research to come up with important ideas. But, but like everything else in economics, this is in dispute. So here's a paper, just fresh off the presses, as you can see, coming out of France. Basically, you can't tell from the title, but basically this is a criticism of the Nick Bloom et al. Paper, essentially saying, if you change the assumptions a little bit and you look at the data, it turns out, in fact, innovation is just going as well as it ever has been. So, I'm probably not going to see, given my age, how this is going to end up. But younger people here may in 50 years reflect back on this talk and figure, God, whether I was right or not, you'll be able to tell. So essentially, here is my argument in a nutshell. And that is, it may well be that the lower hanging fruits, as Gordon puts it, have all been picked. But the problem, of course, is that science builds taller and taller ladders, that we can climb higher up into the tree of knowledge. And in fact, the best fruits of the tree of knowledge may be at the top because they get more sunshine. And the tree is still growing. And in fact, it's growing very fast. And so the fact that the low-hanging fruits have been picked, it really doesn't preclude further radical innovation. That's the argument which I'm trying to convince you of. So we've been here before. Okay, this debate has been going on at least since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And here's a very famous quote that many of you, I'm sure, have seen. This is from Thomas Babington Macaulay, basically saying, yeah, there's all these people who are predicting that this is written in 1830, so it's essentially after the Industrial Revolution is over, and people said, all right, yeah, we've invented all this, machinery and all these wonderful things, but this is it, we're done. And this is what, and I love this last sentence. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? Okay, this is sort of a classic sort of Whiggish statement, as the enemies of the future would call it. I mean, I'm probably Whiggish myself, and, so be it. So it's the future of technological progress. Innovation can be summarized in one very, eloquent Americanism. So that's it. All right. Now, how can I be sure? And, predicting the future, as the old gag goes, it's particularly hazardous. And the best I can do is talk a little bit about how innovation was driven in the past. What are sort of the engines of innovation? And then, ask myself, if these things hold now, and how likely is it that innovation will continue? Essentially, that's the argument. So here's one way of thinking about it, and this is, I think, so what is the connection really between technology, which is the knowledge of how to make things, essentially recipes of how to build things and make things and run things, and science, which looks for natural phenomena and regularity. So the old sort of standard linear model that everybody hates basically says, well, you start with pure science, so you investigate nature, and then you apply it a little bit, you look what the applications are, then come the engineers who make it work, and finally you go to production. Now, everybody understands that that is not really how the world works, because it's more complicated than that. And one of the important things is that there is feedback. There's feedback from technology into science, which may be just as important as the connection between science and technology. So there's one. So this is the feedback from technology to science, and of course there's also a feedback from engineering to science. And so what you get here, of course, if you think about it, this is a dynamic positive feedback model. So A causes B to grow, and B causes A to grow, and you don't have to be a great mathematician to understand that that actually can create a dynamic system that does not converge, depending on the parameters and a few other things. And I'm going to argue is that there's good reason to believe that this system does not converge, and therefore the pessimists are wrong. Essentially, that's the argument, okay? So what does this mean in reality is, you think about somebody invents a technique, to make something. Now, that technique turns out to be useful in creating scientific insight. So think about the telescope. Okay, I'll show you a picture in a minute. That's a classic case. The telescope was an invention. The guys who built it basically were just tinkering around, but it fell into the hands of a famous astronomer, and the famous astronomer then basically said, I can. That gives me an insight into the structure of the universe, and that leads to another technique, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's basically how this positive feedback mechanism works. You can make it more complicated, but that's the bare bones of it. So here is an example. And I'm an historian, so I'm going to take you to the 17th century. So this is what I already talked about. This is a replica of Galileo's telescope. This here is Hooke's microscope. So these are two of the inventions that drove what is sometimes known as the scientific revolution, right? The telescope and a microscope. And these were inventions by any definition. They weren't. And so here's another one. This is an air pump made by Robert Boyle, made in the 1650s. And essentially, it's quite important because the air pump showed once and for all that Aristotle was wrong and that nature does not abhor a vacuum. You can actually create a vacuum. It's kind of gory how they did it. They put a cat inside this thing and then pumped out all the air, and then we're watching with great interest how this cat suffocated and died. You couldn't get away with that today, but this is the 17th century, so there you have it. This is another inventor. This is Evangelista Torricelli, who was a student of Galileo's, and he discovered the existence of the atmospheric pressure in 1643 using this thing, which it may not look like it, but that's a barometer. Okay? Now, once you understand vacuum, and once you understand atmospheric pressure, this is what you get. This is the very first model anybody ever built of what looks like a steam engine. This is Denis Papin, French Huguenot. This is his picture. He never actually... He built a model, but he never actually got it to work. But this is 1707. By 1712, Newcomen had actually built a machine that works. This is what the steam engine looks like a century later. This is, a serious piece of equipment. This is a Corliss machine of 1849. One of the glories of technology of the mid-19th century. And of course, if you look for the 20th century, the number of examples of this nature multiply over and over again. So a few, just an example. This is X-ray crystallography. This is the guy who came up with the theory, Max von Laue, and this is the guy who built the first spectrometer which is what you use in X-ray crystallography. Okay, so this man is distinguished for at least two reasons. The first is that, as far as I know, it's the only case in which father and son won a Nobel Prize for physics together. And the secondly, that he bears a remarkable semblance to John Cleese, if you think about it. You know, take off the moustache and there's John Cleese, but there you have it. So this is the most famous use, of course, of crystal spectroscopy. This is Rosalind Franklin, whose use of the technique helped discover the structure of DNA, for which two colleagues got the Nobel Prize, but she didn't, which is, until the present day, one of the great injustices of the history of science. But for me, it works well, because it's another case of a tool, a technology, producing science. And of course, then that science is used to produce a zillion other techniques, and on it goes. So what about today? Well, I haven't, unfortunately, way too many examples that I can possibly show, but here is one. This is something Galileo never had. This is a technology to study science. This is the European Extremely Large Telescope, built somewhere in the Andes. And they're using something called adaptive optics. So to show you what this can do, this is a regular picture of the planet Uranus. This is a picture taken using adaptive optics. I mean, this technique really works and helps us to do better science. Now, this is, of course, something that Galileo certainly wouldn't have dreamed about. This is the James Webb Space Telescope. And of course, this is something Louis Pasteur would have liked to have, but never had. This is a three-dimensional super-resolution fluorescent microscope, sort of the top of the line. But the top of the line today is much, much better than the top of the line even 5 or 10 years ago. So this technology keeps evolving. And of course, with these powerful microscopes, you can learn stuff that we could never even dream about on the nano level, which is quite amazing. So then, of course, the other scientific tool, which really had multiple applications. I mean, I could go on and on about it. So here's a whole list of them, and that's lasers. So this is a laser actually at Northwestern, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there you go. This is our Center for Quantum Devices. Okay, so this is a laser. And, lasers are used for zillions of things, including, by the way, archaeology. But it was used to detect gravitational waves. This is for somebody got the Nobel Prize for that. This is something that was speculated by Einstein, never could be proven empirically until this technology came around. So this is huge. And now, of course, the ultimate GPT, which is artificial intelligence. I'm not going to spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it as I would like to. So there's a big debate about how impactful AI is going to be on our society, right? But whatever it's going to do, it's a fantastic research assistant. And, I get up, after an evening's work, and I go, how did I ever manage without this? No, it's really that wonderful. So here is a description of AI as a research assistant, okay? So AI is the best research assistant ever devised because it can instantly analyze vast amounts of information, blah, 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 blah. Its ability to automate tedious tasks, synthesize complex data, and provide real-time recommendations make it indispensable for researchers across all fields. Who said that? ChatGPT. I asked it, write that, and this is what came out in literally 20 seconds. So I worry about my students writing their papers that way, but there's ways of checking for that. Now there is a fair amount of hype, and it's a bit early in the game to know exactly. So here is a piece of hype. Okay, this is Martin Gurry writing this. This is 2 weeks ago, and the human race at the interface is super connected to itself. This is a species-altering event. I don't know about that. It sounds worrisome. I don't know. What would you think about it? Now, here are there are also skeptics. Here's a skeptic. This is in the New York Times also 2 weeks ago. And she calls AI, which she calls mid-tech, and claims that the effects are seriously overhyped. Perhaps it's a so-so technology. And then she's quoting two of my friends, saying this is a so-so technology, and they're nifty for a while. Eventually, they become background noise or annoying at best. I don't know about that, but so we can still see hyping on one hand and great skepticism on the other hand. Now, it's possible that the impact of AI on the economy, in the end, will be second order, in the sense that the direct effect of AI is not going to throw zillions of people out of work. It's not going to make my job redundant or your job redundant or anybody like that. It'll probably do what technology always does, which is it makes us more productive and it makes the work more enjoyable because it's the routine, annoying, boring things that are easily mechanized. Where its impact is going to be first order is exactly on what I said earlier, which is it's going to have incredible impact on research in a whole host of areas. And I'm not going to list all of them, but I'd like at least to mention two. One of them is in medicine. So there's a whole bunch of things that it can do in things like immunology and virology. I'm partial to that because my wife's a professor of immunology. But, it can do all these wonderful things. You can read it here for yourself. But it goes way beyond those two fairly narrow fields of medicine. Here's a whole bunch of other things. Genomic medicine. So you need to sequence millions of genomes, which creates, data sets of enormous scales, which, you couldn't possibly find patterns in unless you had AI doing it. There is proteomics, which is the study of proteins. Again, hugely important AI models here. This is the DeepMind's AlphaFold, which has really revolutionized research in the area of proteins. Now, combining these together, it is changing the drug industry. So the drug industry has been subject to what is known as Eroom's law. Now, don't start worrying about who Mr. Eroom was. There's no such person as Mr. Eroom. This is more written backward. It's a variation on Moore's law, which is the famous law that says that the capabilities of microprocessors doubles every year, and this is basically the other way around. It says that the number of new drugs approved per dollar declines every 9 years. Now, AI is the best hope that we have to reverse that, and there's some evidence that it does. So that, in that sense, the impact of this technological change on science may be indeed revolutionary. Well, then there's other things like medical imaging. If you've had an X-ray taken or an MRI, it's often read by a machine which is using artificial intelligence, and perhaps most relevant today, at least, is in epidemiology. So again, epidemiology needs, enormous data sets, in which you have thousands of data points for each individual, and then you have millions of individuals trying to look for patterns of how contagious diseases spread. Now, by the way, the last two slides actually come from a discussion paper called Deep Research, which I checked it is actually written by 3 humans, which was a relief, I thought. All right. Now there is, leaving aside medicine, look at material science. Material science is critically important, ladies and gentlemen, because for most of economic history, the number of materials that we have had at our disposal has been constant and very small. So we've had wood, we've had leather, we have ceramics, we have iron, we have a few other metals. Basically, that was it, okay? And then things start to change with the inventions of synthetics in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now we, of course, have a lot of synthetic materials, but that seems to run into all kind of blocks. And so we need to discover new materials, and this is what material scientists do. And so Genome, which is graphic networks of material exploration, is also developed by Google DeepMind. And they have identified something like 2.2 million new crystal structures, of which about 380,000 are stable, meaning they are in principle can be used. And so these can be used for, again, for a million things: superconductors, batteries, photovoltaics, you name it. I just, this morning they had something on the news that China may be considering limitation of rare earths to the United States as part of the current situation, shall we say. And, the hope is, of course, that this kind of research will eventually find substitutes for these rare earths. So this is how Genome does it. Basically, you can either start with a known crystal and then go all the way down until you come by the new material, or you start with a chemical formula and you graph the neural network's predicted stability, and then you look for other combinations to create stable composition. It's a fantastic technique to research science. So this is the kind of thing that comes out of there. Okay, so this is sort of a picture of one of the 2.2 million. They don't all look that neatly, but I thought this was particularly striking, so I decided to show it to you. So now this is how does AI support science. So this is the number of scholarly publications that can be identified by an AI procedure, by the way, to use AI. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Surprise, surprise. The highest is in physical sciences, but you can also see that health sciences is picking up particularly recently with the sort of further developments in AI, which make it so much better. And my own field, social sciences, humanities, you can see this is a bit of a hockey stick kind of phenomenon, and I find that encouraging. It doesn't prove anything, but it does tell you people are actually using this stuff. Okay, so this is some way in which this is from a physical paper physics, and basically tells you that this, the various paradigms in science, and sort of the fourth paradigm is big data, machine learning patterns, anomalies. And then AI-generated hypothesis with autonomous testing. So AI both generates the hypothesis and does the tests. I don't think we can quite get rid of the scientist yet. And sort of these dark predictions that eventually we all can go home and AI will do our research for us strikes me as fanciful. But this is obviously a major, major tool. Okay? And so here's the big question. What can possibly go wrong? And I want to spend, a few minutes talking about what can possibly go wrong, because so far I've been quite Pollyannish, and unfortunately, the world is more complicated than that. So here's one concern: institutions. So this is my old friend, the late Douglas North. You can sort of see he's worried. In this picture, but he is sort of the father of institutional analysis in economic history, and clearly the big issue that he worried about was, will institutions be able to adapt to rapid technological change? And for that, we actually have a case study, which is the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And the Industrial Revolution in Britain was an acceleration of the rate of technological change, but we can also see that institutions eventually adapt. In Britain, it went fairly smoothly. There never was a real revolution, no barricades in the streets, and so on and so forth. On the continent, things were a little bit more rowdy, but, eventually institutions have adapted to the changes brought by the first and second industrial revolution. But what evolutionary theories suggest is that typically, if the environment is changing, adaptation can take place if the changes aren't, drastic and dramatic and abrupt enough. Okay, if the environment changes very rapidly, they can't adapt because there just isn't enough time. And so, when the meteorite hit Yucatan in what is it, 65 million years ago, it was a sudden abrupt event and nobody could adapt because this all happened in a matter of months. And so 90% of all species went extinct. But in other cases, the adaptation can take place. But the acceleration of technological change that I was implying causes concern because will we be able to get our institutions to adapt to this new environment? And, it's quite possible that it will not. Now, I want to make one more observation and then tell you where this is going. I have argued now for many years what I call the upper tail human capital hypothesis. So this is kind of a fancy term for basically saying that dynamism, if you want to call it, or certainly technological and scientific change, are not carried out by the average person, but by a fairly small number of people who tend to be, on the whole, having very high levels of human capital. Okay, so they are in the upper tail of the human capital distribution, if you want. It's not, of course, just inventors and scientists. It's not just James Watt and Isaac Newton. It's thousands and thousands of engineers, practical mathematicians, physicians, technicians, entrepreneurs, people like that. But it's still, once you look at it, we're talking about a few tens of thousands of people, which is a few percentage of the population. And so what makes these people click? What makes them work? And so for these people, this elite, to generate new knowledge, you need two things. The first is you need incentives. So economics has shown 1 million years ago that production of knowledge is under-incentivized, right? Because you can't own it in some sense, right? I mean, and what's more, it's non-rivalrous in the sense that if I have some and I give you some, I don't have any less myself. And so that is typically what we call sort of the properties of public goods. And so so that means it's very hard to make money on these things. And in fact, incentivizing scientists has always been a major problem. The other thing that you need is you need a free market for ideas, something I've been arguing for a long time. You want both the supply side and the demand side for ideas to be decentralized. You don't want any entity to have too much market power, as we call it. So, a classic example would be the Soviet Union, where obviously the government, established a monopoly in the market for ideas, and in fact, it explains sort of the rather disappointing performance of the Soviet Union in technological and scientific progress. And so we need the right institutions. And so my book that Ryan was generous enough to mention basically points out that in what we call early modern Europe, which is entirely a construction of historians, of course, these two conditions were increasingly met in Europe. And that led to increasingly intellectual dynamics in many areas. And so it gave us, in the end, people like James Watt and Adam Smith and Antoine Lavoisier, Euler, Alessandro Volta, Beethoven, I mean, you name it, okay? People who innovated and created new ideas, incentivized by the institutions of that time. So does that hold today? And at one level, the answer is yes. We today have incentives to people who produce science and technology and knowledge, far more than anybody ever had, okay? So what do we offer people who have new ideas or who contribute? Well, we offer them financial security, which is essentially tenured jobs in universities or similar institutions. We give them, if they're particularly distinguished, we give them named chairs. But then there is much more. And the interesting thing is that most of these incentives are very cheap. Okay? So we give prizes like the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize is $1 million, so you'd think it's not, that's not cheap. But trust me, for the people who earn it, their contribution to society exceeds that by a huge factor, okay? But then there are inexpensive recognitions, like, membership in academies. So I'm a member of something called the American Academy of Arts and Science, okay? The net payment that I get a year is minus $350, which is my membership fee. So why do it? Because, of course, it sends a signal. It sends, it's a matter of reputation. And so the other thing is, of course, that name recognition and fame through mass media. Some scientists, some economists become superstars, sometimes for the wrong reason. And finally, of course, a teeny tiny fraction of them actually make money, particularly in some areas where you can make patents or get successful startups, okay? But the incentives are huge. People still want to get PhDs and go into research. That, I think, is something that we have kept going. So some of these things, actually, we can see them coming into being after 1500. So there was the Royal Society, or membership was a strong signal, founded in 1660, and Isaac Newton, while he was at Cambridge, was the Lucasian professor of mathematics. That chair still exists, I think. But this is small potatoes compared to the many incentives that we have today. Now, how competitive is the market for ideas today? Well, I would have said that until a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, the international market for ideas was extremely competitive, in part because the United States had an open door for foreign academics and entrepreneurs. And it's a highly competitive system in which top quality institutions, all the way from Caltech and Harvard down, competed with one another for the best scientists. Okay, and so what the United States was benefiting from was, in fact, this open door policy, which not only brought in talent from all over the world, but of course also created more competition for local people. So many universities, including my own, full of foreign names. And so immigration and dynamics is something that has been investigated quite a bit, and we know basically what the numbers are, okay? So if you look at all the workers in computer and mathematical fields in Silicon Valley, 67% of them were born outside the United States. The 50 immigrant-founded unicorn startup, and unicorn startup is a startup that has more than $1 billion in revenue. Of those, so 50 immigrant-founded unicorn startups have a combined value of $248 billion and created an average 1,200 jobs each. There's a nice paper by Rebecca Diamond from Stanford who looked at patents, and he looked at 880,000 Americans who patented between 1990 and 2016. So that's a lot of patents. So that's not a bad proxy for at least a segment of the upper tail of the human capital, okay? So immigrants make up 16% of all inventors, okay, which you think is low, but they actually are responsible for 30% of all aggregate innovation because of the spillover effects. So basically, their contribution is twice as much as their direct contribution. And other people have found various things, like immigrant-owned firms are far more innovative than native-born things. On and on. An open door creates innovation, not only because it benefits us, because it benefits everybody. And so, conclusion is, which is says here on the bottom, that if you're going to attack immigrant-friendly policies, that may be one of the enemies of innovation. Now, the other thing is that the world in 17th and 18th century was highly fragmented politically, at least the European world. China is a different story, of course. But competition between nations was conducive to scientific research because nations wanted to sort of stay ahead of one another for obvious reasons. And so Edward Gibbon, who wrote the Decline of the Roman Empire, essentially said the problem with the Roman Empire was it wasn't fragmented, it was unified, and so there wasn't enough competition. But today, he says, this is the end of the rise and fall, Europe is broken up in all these kingdoms and they're competing with each other. That's good for us. I mean, David Hume and Immanuel Kant and others sort of agreed. And so the question then is, well, we're moving in that direction because everybody's talking now about the deglobalization. And is deglobalization good or bad for technological progress? And, well, so my thinking about this is essentially this. The one thing that globalization is good at is it keeps nations competing one with one another. They're not going to merge, they're not going to unify, although the EU is a counterexample. But basically what happens is that if you resist a certain technology, which is actually progressive, my favorite example is GMOs, right? Genetically modified organisms, which the Europeans are dead set against, and Americans have discovered that actually it works. And so, well, for Europeans, if you, in a globalized world in which their agriculture has relatively low levels of protection, they're going to have to adopt these techniques, or else their agriculture will not be able to compete with the United States. So, in a competitive world, in general, okay, it is extremely hard for nations to resist progress without becoming second or third rate players, okay? An example from European history is the counter-revolution in Spain, which really suppressed innovation under the aegis of, heresy or apostasy or words like that I don't like. And basically, Spain falls off the map in terms of scientific and technological progress after the middle of the 17th century, and it succeeds this to countries that are much more open-minded, like Great Britain, Netherlands, later on France and Germany, and so on. So in a globalized world, of course, what is true is that if an invention is made somewhere, it's made everywhere, right? Because it spreads incredibly quick. And so you can still be technologically reactionary, but you'll end up looking like, Myanmar or, North Korea or Iran or something like that. You could also take, obviously, in certain areas, these countries are encouraging technology. And so the difference between the early modern period and our own time is, of course, speed. Things happen much faster today. All right? My sense is, however, that the danger is not deglobalization, it's economic nationalism, which is very much the flip side of it, okay? Because various aggressive measures of economic nationalism, sanctions and tariffs and non-tariff barriers and support for so-called strategic industries, okay? They are costly and they will seriously slow down progress. And above all, maybe there's populism, because populism, by its definition, is anti-elitism. Now, having read a bit about populism, some of it's understandable. Elites haven't always been extremely nice. They certainly have been, smug and arrogant, and so on and so forth. The problem with populism is that it's an understandable response, but it obviously eventually ends up replacing the elite with a worse elite. And so you end up throwing away the baby of progress with the bathwater of these elites. And that may be extremely costly to the economy. Okay. So, I'm going to run out of time. But one of the things that populist regimes do is attack universities, in case you hadn't noticed. So here are three non-American examples: Turkey, Hungary. So in Hungary, as you know, Orban essentially kicked out the best university in this country, which is the European, the Central European University. In Turkey, Erdogan has put hundreds and hundreds of professors in jail and fired tens of thousands of them. And in Israel, which is also becoming increasingly populist, they now have legislation on the books, not yet passed, that will allow a government ministry to essentially identify faculty members, even tenured people, and essentially fire them without due process if they are found to denounce Zionism or denounce, make various political statements that people don't like. So populism attacks the upper tail of the human capital distribution. That is extremely scary. So, we're already losing these people. But I want to make one more point. I want to talk about focusing devices. So give me a few more minutes. Bear with me. Because focusing devices is one of the engines that drives technological change that isn't perhaps as widely recognized as the other. So this is the man who wrote a classic article about focusing devices. My late friend now, Nate Rosenberg, who's a Stanford professor, has a classic article about this. And essentially the idea is this, that science and technology advance most rapidly when there is a recognized need for a specific solution to a specific problem that bothers the economy or society in some other way. And so what you do is you concentrate all your best people in solving that problem. Now, that doesn't guarantee it will get solved. Sometimes, it's beyond their power. But here is an interesting way of thinking about the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, say, before it, in 1700, take it. Britain faces a bunch of well-defined and concrete issues that were bothering people. Here, and these are the 5 issues. I can make this list longer, but you get the point. How to pump water out of mines. They used coal mostly for home heating, but these mines tended to flood, because the water level was high. How to spin high-quality cotton yarn inexpensively and without the use of human fingers, which is how spinning had always been done. How to turn pig iron into wrought iron. How to fight smallpox, which is the great scourge of the age. And how to solve the issue of longitude at sea. I could make this list longer, but you get it. And this interesting thing is, by 1815, all 5 of these problems had been solved. Because people spent enormous amount of time, of research and effort discovering them. Now, we know about the people who succeeded in solving this problem. For every successful entrepreneur or inventor, there would be hundreds who got close or not so close, but who basically failed. But for society, that doesn't matter. The problems were solved. That is what increases economic welfare. And so for the 20th century, I can make a number of, the best examples are maybe, the Haber-Bosch nitrogen-fixing technique, which is invented in Germany on the eve of World War I, the Salk-Sabin polio vaccine, when there was the great polio fear of the 1930s and 1940s, Project Manhattan sort of stands up as an obvious example, all the way to the moon landing. So these are just focusing devices. Society decides, we are going to fix this, we are going to solve this. And most of the time, they do. And so what about our own age? Well, here are a list of 10 problems that our society has to solve. I'm not going to read all of them because I'm running out of time. But you can, other people's lists will differ on 1 or 2 items. But I don't think there could be huge dispute that these are issues that we are struggling with and that in principle will have, or hopefully have, technological solutions in one form or another. Some people, myself probably included, think that one and 2 eventually will dominate all the others, but that still, remains to be seen. Now, of course, in order for these problems to be solved, they need to be prioritized. And there are cases in which the market does the work for you, right? So the market will say, whoever invents this will become filthy rich, so everybody gets in on it. Or the market will, in some other way, signal. But in many cases, actually, you need government intervention. So, Project Manhattan, needless to say, was not done by the free market, but neither was the Haber-Bosch process invented before World War II. And so you really need some authority to take care of this and to make this a priority. And I must say, I don't see in the United States enough of prioritization of many of these problems. They don't come up nearly as much as the price of eggs. And in the election campaign that we just went through, I sort of disappointed that people didn't say, well, look, we've got all these issues that we need to solve. We need to spend resources solving them. And so here's my sort of conclusion. Unlike what Bob Gordon says, I'm sort of stretching this a bit, but it's implied. We are not about to languish into an age of barbarism like the Roman Empire or Qing China or anything like that. Technological change will be with us for a very long time, and it may basically never run into diminishing returns if this feedback model that I put up for you is going to keep holding, okay? So economic growth will continue. It will not maybe continue in the way that economists traditionally measure, which is through the national income accounting system. There may be lots of things that are improving human welfare a great deal without necessarily increasing GDP per capita or total factor productivity or these other things that people look at, okay? But that's fine with me. I can see a major invention. I can know a major invention when I see it, okay? And so, if that is the case, then the best is you ain't seen nothing yet. And the digital age will be to the analog age what the Iron Age was to the Stone Age, and on and on. And we can't even more imagine what the post-digital age would look like, because we're not in it yet. We're in the digital age, okay? Any more than, say, you can imagine how Archimedes could imagine CERN or something like that. I mean, this is just way beyond our imagination. But there's no room for optimism exactly because of what North said. And many years before Doug North, Freud said with his masterly understatement, this is the last paragraph of The Future of an Illusion. And he says, while mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature, right, which I was saying, and may be expected to make still greater ones, it is not possible to establish with certainty, I mean, this is a very understated thing, that a similar advance has been made in the management of human affairs. I mean, read between the lines. And, you look at what people are worried about. So the IMF has warned that the biggest threat to the world economy is geopolitical risk. All of those things that I was talking about earlier. So the most serious headwinds, that is not, as Gordon claimed, not the national debt and not the aging of the population, as he contended. The most serious headwind is this. Against stupidity, the God themselves contend in vain. Thank you. Do we have time for questions, Ryan?
Hi, Josh Banerjee. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Civitas. I agree in principle with your point that it may be technically feasible for an economy to continue expanding its production possibility frontier through time at a constant rate. My worry lies more on the political side. And I think of the work of someone like Mansur Olson and the vested special interest groups that are out there. I think of the Bocconi School of Political Economy in the 90s, Alesina and Perotti and the new political macroeconomics, and they constructed a wide range of models suggesting that we can end up in second best equilibria very, very much indefinitely, and we never transition to the first order state of nature, right? And how do we break out of that inertia?
I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, I think that is the kind of literature that underlies, Doug's concern. So he wants. I'll tell you one more story about North. So he says, we had a conversation once, and he says to me, Joel, there's a reason why we talk about technological progress, but institutional change.
Joel, I want you to speak into the microphone.
Sorry. Yeah. He said, we talk about technological progress, right? There's a trend there, right? But institutional change, it is far from obvious that institutions get better over time. There are periods when they get better, there are periods when they get worse. Is this a stationary process? And I don't think we know. But the big hope, was, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and you get all these sort of end of history Fukuyama kind of things. And today, I think people are far less sanguine about how much better institutions get. We look at a large number of countries in the world that are demonstrably failed states, and in others where the state hasn't failed, but it seems to be not getting any more effective in providing things. So that is exactly the kind of things that I worry about. So, markets work reasonably well in providing material goods and services. Political markets work very different. And in fact, people like Buchanan and Mansur and other people working on that, Alberto, this is the upshot of a huge literature that says, there's no reason to believe that political markets work well. It's not just, multiple equilibria also. That's clearly a big deal. There are many other ways in which these markets fail. My own take on this, and this you may not agree, but I have sort of come slow to the somewhat sad conclusion that authoritarian regimes are essentially absorbing states. That once you move, for one reason, from democracy to an authoritarian regime, it's very hard to move back. The two main ways in which you go back is A, the old man dies, like Franco or Stalin, okay? And so then, perhaps if there's no obvious successor who continues. So the other way is that other countries come in and essentially overthrow you, like Mussolini.
To the microphone.
Huh?
To the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. But I'm loud enough. But you look at people like Mussolini and Saddam Hussein, people like that. So people come from the outside and overthrow them. But, if you leave things on their own, they don't, the autocrats don't tend to go away. Ceausescu may be the one exception that we can think of. But roughly it doesn't happen. Democracies have a way of self-destructing. Okay, I can give you example after example of in which elections bring about an outcome that eventually does away with democracy. It's not just, the German elections of 1932 that everybody knows about, but you think about the rise of Napoleon III, okay? It's a wonderful case study that Marx wrote about in his 18th of Brumaire. So what happens is that in 1848, the February Revolution established the most democratic regime in the world. Everybody could, only men, of course, but every man could vote regardless of income. And so you get these elections, and they elect Louis Napoleon as president. 3 years later, he overthrows the democracy and said, we don't need any of this, and I'm going to be emperor. And in fact, he stays emperor for almost 20 years until he gets overthrown by losing a war. But these things do happen. But he had to end up like Saddam Hussein. He had the War of 1870-71 not broken out. We may still have Bonaparte emperors in France, for all I can tell. So I couldn't agree with you more. And when I wrote a bunch of essays in which I expressed my optimism about this, it was 2014, 2015. And you couldn't quite see, the rise of really bad dictators. Even people like Putin, you couldn't quite tell, what they were going to turn out to be. And in many places, remember Erdogan got elected democratically, Orban got elected democratically. So these people looked okay, but the institutions just weren't strong enough. And that is, I think, a major concern. And then, of course, it throws a monkey wrench into the works of which I was thinking, which is institutions have to adapt to changing technology. And I'm really worried that adaptation is going to fail or produce things that are really scary, like the surveillance state in China, for instance. Sorry, long answer to a short question, but that's what you get with me.
So, in terms of technological progress, we've talked a lot about how institutions can kind of fail to adapt to rapid technological change. What are some ways, like, for example, Britain in the Industrial Revolutions, that institutions can successfully adapt, and what are the characteristics of those institutions that allow them to adapt successfully?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really cool example in the 19th century, because the way Britain changes its institution is different from everybody else. You know, in France, every time you want to say you want to change an institution, you throw a barricades on the streets, and you wave the tricolor, and you shoot your guns at the soldiers, and eventually the soldiers go home, and you establish a new government, or in the first case you tear down the Bastille and liberate all its 4 prisoners, and things like that. In England, in Britain, they don't do that. They have an institution that changes other institutions. I call that a meta-institution. That's Parliament. Okay, so Parliament observes that technological change causes side effects that weren't anticipated. For instance, child labor. Okay, they're obsessed with child labor. There's at least 4 times an attempt to pass legislation to prohibit child labor because they think it's a bad thing. In the end, it works, but it takes them half a century. But you look at, say, urban pollution. You look at local government. Industrialization requires more public good. It requires, clean water. It requires sewage works. And then you get cholera, so it gets even, more acute. But every time, basically, Parliament, rises to the task. Now, it could take it 10 years, it could take it 20 years, but eventually they pass the legislation. And then, what does industrialization need? It needs workers that are literate. At some point, the demands of technology are such that even unskilled workers have to be able to read and write and do basic arithmetic. And so country after country passes legislation that creates mandatory and free education for children. That's the kind of thing that that I think consider of adaptation. The biggest adaptation of all, and I may get in trouble here, but I don't care. What we understand today is that all technological change involves winners and losers, always. I mean, the only invention that I ever think of that didn't get any losers at all was the invention of aspirin in 1896. But even there, if you push me hard enough, I'll probably think of something. But basically, always losers, right? And that's sort of the nature of the beast. Now, how do you adapt to the fact that there are losers? The answer that Europeans, and to a somewhat lesser extent the Americans, found is you create a welfare state. You create safety nets so that losers who end up losing their job or whose skills become obsolete, usually people don't lose their jobs all that much, but their skills become obsolete, and that's bad enough. That in some sense you don't let them starve, you don't throw them out on the streets. That's what the welfare state to a great extent did, and that's a massive institutional adaptation that I think isn't seen as that, But in fact, if you want to see this being supported, you should read. It's now maybe 20 years old, but it's a book by Peter Lindert called Going Public, which has an argument that basically says the welfare state is a free lunch. And it's a free lunch because it created an adaptation to technology that prevented, far worse responses by people who ended up on the losing end of the process. That, I think, is the kind of thing I have in mind. Now, I can't tell you what kind of institutional adaptation we can come up with other technological changes. For instance, artificial intelligence or social media, for instance, the proliferation of social media. I think we're struggling with it, but we're not doing very well to date, I think. But that's what will have to happen. If it doesn't happen, it could be catastrophic.
Joel, for that was being... Yeah, thanks.
All right, excellent.
It's great.